Hello everybody and welcome back to another Wizard 101 video. And I want you to think for a second, right? When you think of PvE, you think of the best schools, you think of what you consider to be the best schools for this game overall. What do you think? You may think something like Fire. You may think something maybe Storm, Life, Death. There's so many different opinions on that. And you may notice when asking people that, there's one school that I feel like is never brought up. It's never brought into the equation, literally ever. And that is Myth. Now, obviously there's some reasons for that, and I think that PvP players have a different conception of Myth than us filthy PvE players, you know, obviously, because Myth is definitely a lot better in PvP, but the wide conception of Myth, and has been for a very, very long time, is that Myth is just never the best option. It's never like a solid option, and it's definitely a conception that's been around for a long time. So what I want to go over this video is why I think Myth is generally misunderstood, why I think its conceptions around it are genuinely bad, the positives, the negatives of Myth, you know, all that, my opinion on it. So without further ado, let's get into the video. So I want to start this video by talking about the general public conception. I've obviously already mentioned it, but I haven't mentioned how bad Myth's conception is to the public yet, because it is surprisingly bad. I remember back when I was a kid, Myth was actually like not just disliked or not cared about, people despised the school of Myth. Myth Wizards were seen as like the worst option in any case in this game, because Myth Wizards generally were far and few between, and the ones that existed weren't very good because Myth just wasn't a decent school. It wasn't seen as the best for literally any reason. If you want to play support, you can pick Death or Balance. If you want to play a hitter, you can pick Fire or Storm. If you want to heal, you can pick Life or Ice. There's no one thing that Myth is the best at, and it really made Myth disliked. And I remember that this was the wide conception for the longest time. Myth was just not that good. And I would say that this didn't start changing until two things happened. First off, Zen Master Blue made his Myth walkthrough, legendary Myth walkthrough, back in, what was that, 2013, 2014? And I would say that was the step number one, because Zen Master Blue was generally universally loved, and I mean, I say generally, but he was just universally loved by the community, and his walkthrough also really showed that Myth wasn't that bad, you know? Myth definitely still stacked up in regards to the other schools. It wasn't nearly as bad as most people made it out to be. This was the first shift, in my opinion. The second, and this one was definitely bigger, was the spell audit that was released 2-3 years ago that changed Orthrus to be a hit-all spell. This really changed Myth as a whole, and the reason for that is that Myth, when people said it was bad, it genuinely did not have a really good spell to use in regard to hit-all. There was Humunga Frog, but that was really it, the 4-pip AoE. Earthquake didn't do a lot of damage at all. In fact, it still doesn't do a lot of damage. If you look at it, it's like, it does 370, which is barely more than Humunga Frog, so that wasn't good. Orthrus just generally wasn't that good. And Mystic Colossus obviously costs a Shadow Pip, and Shadow Pips are very hard to come by. So generally, Myth didn't have that hit, and when they were given that hit, all of a sudden people were like, oh, hey, this is actually a viable option now, especially since they are given the most damaging 7-pip AoE in base damage. So overall, those were the shifting points, I would say, where Myth stopped being viewed as the most garbage school and started being viewed as a semi-viable option. But that doesn't change what I'm saying here. I think a lot of people still really sleep on Myth. They really don't consider Myth to be a really, really good option. What I want to kind of go over is the positives, negatives of Myth, and the sheer potential that I think Myth has. So to start off, let's actually talk about the negatives first, because I think this is important. This is what people focus on with Myth that really makes Myth to be considered a bottom tier option for a lot of people. First off, there's the fact that their minions really aren't that helpful, and I've obviously said this before in the past, and I've talked about this a lot on my channel. Minions really aren't that good. Minions aren't very useful in PvE combat at all, simply because they either are too weak to actually do any damage or any lasting impact on the battle, they're a waste of pips, or simply just because of the fact that you can't control them and they actually are more a hindrance than a help. All of these options combine to where minions just are generally unhelpful, and considering it's one of Myth's main focuses, especially in the beginning, that really is a problem and has been a problem for a very long time. Then you have the fact that they also have a lot of stuns on their spells, and some really impactful stuns as well. Like Medusa has that 2-round stun, but the problem is that stuns don't really do anything. They aren't particularly useful in regards to many situations because bosses have full stun immunity, especially around Arc 2 when you get Medusa. And this is obviously just a big issue for every school, not just Myth. But the final thing I want to emphasize in terms of weakness that I kind of already said earlier is that Myth isn't the strongest. It's not the strongest in a lot of situations where if you're looking for the best hitter, fire's obviously the best hitter. If not fire, what next? Then a storm. In terms of support, you have death, you have life even, maybe balance. All of these can support a school very well. You have healing, which obviously Myth isn't that good at healing either. Myth just seems to kind of be this weird option where it doesn't really fit under any branches. It could fit under an attack school, but the problem is that who wants a Myth hitting when there's a perfectly good fire, a perfectly good storm right over there? That's the problem with Myth. The problem with Myth is that it just seems so lackluster. But what I want to talk about today is how I feel like people really overlook the potential of Myth. I think Myth has the potential to be one of the best hitters in this game right alongside fire. I genuinely think they could be just as good, especially since they're part of the spirit school rather than the elemental schools and are a bit different. In regards to positives, obviously there's the fact that they have a surprising amount of damage. The problem with this is that I find is that a lot of Myths don't really utilize their full potential when it comes to damage. Obviously, it's not as much as fire, but I've seen Myths get somewhere up in the 160 to 180 range and be genuinely better than a lot of fires. And they're definitely an option. Myth can be just as good as fire, and I think that the main reason why they're not seen that way is simply just because of either stereotypes around Myth not being good or the fact that people focus way too much on fire being the hitter. So there's definitely that. They also have the strength where, similar to Death actually, they can fit into a lot of different roles. They can inherently be a good hitter. They can also play decent support. They also have things like Shatter and Pierce to remove shields. Really, they can just be really good utility if they want to be. And I think that's really good to have as a school, to be very versatile and to be able to switch what you're doing as you go. Now, I'm not going to strongly try to force any other positives here. I will say those are the main positives, but I really want to talk about this video is the potential of Myth, because I think Myth could have the potential to be one of the best PvE schools if KingsIsle just focused a bit more on them. Obviously, there is suggestions I've had in the past, like controlling minions would be really useful, but there's also just simply Myth as a whole. I think Myth could really do with a nice utility change, where KingsIsle really emphasizes the fact that Myth can be good at utility. Like, obviously they have Earthquake, which removes charms. They have stuff like Shatter and Pierce, which removes wards. Obviously, they have a lot of util there, but I think that they could really emphasize the util aspect of them on different spells. All they need to do is adjust the spells and make them more apt for Myth. I think that would be really, really good and would really change the school to be even better. The second thing that I'm going to mention actually has to do with more with the community than anything, and that's to stop emphasizing school roles when they don't need to be emphasized. So many people have this conception in their head that fire needs to be the one that hits always, storm needs to be the one that hits if not fire, and that tends to be the most common thought process when it comes to battles. And I think people don't understand that even an ice with 100 damage is better than a fire with 50. It's this weird conception where people take into account the school but not their actual stats, and this is very, very common. Like, the sheer amount of times as a death where, you know, my main is kind of a death now, I've had the highest damage out of everyone and I could genuinely hit, but I'm not even considered for the hitting role. Instead, like a fire with 70, 60 damage is considered. That's crazy to me, because they'll never be the better hitter. And that is really what I think Myth's trap is Myth is in this preconception where they're viewed as not a potential hitter, when really they should be considered just as strongly as Fire and Storm, in my opinion. I think Myth could be just as good of a hitter as Fire or Storm. And that's really what I wanted to emphasize this video. Now, I know that this was kind of like a strange, out of nowhere tangent. Like, recently I've been uploading videos on game features and stuff. I haven't uploaded like a strict opinion piece on a random feature of the game in a while. But I really just wanted to talk about Myth because I have been playing a lot of Myth recently. Obviously, I'm level 120 now, and this Myth Wizard I've had since probably 2013, and I never really quested him up. He's always been like 70, 80 until I started questing him, and I've been having a lot of fun. I genuinely think Myth is pretty good, and you can see my stats are solid, especially for level 120. And once I reach level 130, all of a sudden my damage is probably going to shoot up to like 150 or higher, which is really, really solid. And I think people really underestimate Myth, which is just generally why I wanted to make this video. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Do you think that Myth is genuinely an option, or do you disagree with me? Do you think Myth should just be forever in the shadow realm with no actual viability to them? But that's really it for today. Thank you all for watching. I will see you in the next video. Adios.